Hi. Okay, so let's just get right into this question. This question is about infidelity. I'm sure it is something that will come up lots and lots more, unfortunately. Um, and so I'm going to really try to take some time and dig into this and answer this the best I can, coming from just my experience, my own experience in relationships where there was infidelity, and then also just as a professional working with couples. So, a couple things. When I'm reading your note and just that idea of discovering those text messages, discovering the videos, that sends us into the amygdala, right? So that sends us into the animal brain, that sends us into a place where we are not thinking correctly. We are reactive. We are animalistic. We're primal when we're in that place. That is really meant for us to kind of survive. That's fight or flight, right? Not great for making long-term decisions. And so my advice to you right now in the immediate time is to let your head cool and to get into a better headspace before you make any decisions that are going to impact you and your son's life long term. It's a lot easier when you're not a mom and kids aren't involved and you're just starting off in a new relationship. You can usually just toss them aside and say that was a bad one, right? But when they start to become family and involved with your kids, that's a different story, of course. And so it does take a little bit more thought, and it's not just Velcro anymore. It's more super glue. So my first piece of advice is to not do anything yet, to just let the mind cool. And I would be doing things that are self-care to just get your head in a better space. I would be hanging out with people that you firmly trust, people that love you, people that support you and care for you, and just to get your head in a different place. And to know that life will return, it will get better, but right now, you're kind of in a crisis state. So that's the first piece. In terms of where do you go from there? So there's two thoughts. One, the first thought is a leopard doesn't change his spots, that whole theory. And the idea that if someone's character is lacking enough to cheat in the first place, they're likely to do it again. And it seems like this guy is a repeat offender. He's done it multiple times now. It wasn't just like a text that crossed the line and emotional infidelity. It was actual physical infidelity. There was meditation, premeditation, planning, all of that. So this is someone that is capable of compartmentalizing two different worlds. And that's obviously concerning. There's that thought, right? And you may fully come to that thought and that conclusion and decide that you need to move forward without him, and that would be totally fine. The other line of thought, and I think a lot of women have gone here as well, especially when kids are involved, is the hope for change, okay? And so I'm going to go down this road and talk about some of the resources that you can look at. So Tammy Nelson, Dr. Tammy Nelson, she's a phenomenal resource in the area of infidelity. If you go to her website, drtammynelson.com, so it's drtammynelson.com, she has a ton of resources on there. And when I was in a relationship, this was 20 years ago, I went through a similar thing, and it was pretty devastating. And I found her book. I can't remember. I think it was called After the Affair. And I wasn't in a marriage, but it was a long-term relationship, and it felt like a marriage. And that book really, really helped. I don't know if it's super relevant now because I haven't read it in 20 years, but that would be a really low-hanging fruit that you could try After the Affair. And she might have had some new editions that have come out since then. The other person that I would recommend is Esther Perel. So Esther Perel, Perel. She wrote a book recently called State of Affairs, or something like that. And she did all of this research on infidelity and affairs and how they change relationships, polygamy, polyamorous relationships. So she really looked at the construct that we have around marriage and that monogamy and questioning if that's something that's going to work. So her podcast sometimes goes a little off the rails, but for the most part, it's pretty good advice. So she would be another person that you could easily tune into and kind of hear her advice. And she is top notch in the field of just couples work and infidelity and really kind of differentiation based therapy. So she would be great. In terms of other things that I would say, so when I worked with couples, the number one, the number one goal for healing for the partner that is the victim of all this is the understanding that this is not going to happen again. That's where trust is built, right? And so to be able to come to that understanding, there's all this work that has to be done in therapy. And so the thinking that got the couple here is not going to be the thinking that can pull you out of this. And that's why it's really a good idea to seek professional help. And I know sometimes it's not always possible. So that's what I hope to do in these columns or videos, is just to give you some good free resources and tools and places to start. So this is where I went with my couples when we were dealing with infidelity. And I'm going to use she, but it's not always a she. She has to feel that this is not going to happen again. And part of us feeling that this is not going to happen again is the understanding that the person who is the offender, he or she, has to have some insight into why they did what they did and why that wouldn't happen again, right? So it can't just be apologizing, I'm sorry. There has to be some level of insight and understanding what triggers are there, understanding if there's an addiction in place, like love addiction, understanding if it's a validation issue where they're unable to self-validate. Is it an early childhood issue that's coming up where maybe they had that narcissistic wound that they didn't get from mom and now they're getting it from every female out there? So first, there has to be a willingness for help and a willingness to say, I fucked up and I need to figure out what to do about this. I love you that much that I'll make myself really vulnerable and go through this process to figure out how to make sure it never happens again, right? That is the solid ground that you can move forward with a person. Where there are flags and where I would not recommend moving forward is when you have someone that's highly defensive, shut down, is gaslighting and doing all sorts of deflection tools where you never really get to the core of the issue, who is refusing to go to couples therapy, refusing to admit that there's anything wrong with them in the first place. Those are all issues where the person's going to have really a low level of insight and low motivation to change. One takeaway that it forever stayed with me after reading Esther Perel's book and going to a lot of her conferences is that once there is infidelity in a relationship, that relationship is never again the same. It will never be the same again. And at first that sounds really kind of doom and gloom, but what she meant by that was this is a completely new relationship now. The security and the safety that you might have felt before are completely gone. You are free now to question things that maybe you weren't feeling free to question before. And so the relationship, in a sense, is not broken, but maybe broken open. And that idea of not trying, the goal not being to get back to where you were before. That will never be. It's going to be a new version of you guys, or it's going to be nothing. So I hope that makes sense. I hope that helps. I wrote down some other things. I just want to make sure that I got to all of them. David Schnarch, he's another, I love him. I've attended a lot of his trainings. I've read every single one of his books. He's great. He addresses infidelity as well. And then the last thing that I will say is that you should sit down and have some conditions that would be the conditions by which you would consider moving forward. So if he agreed to these things, and they have to be reasonable, obviously, but they might look like, we're going to go to couples therapy. We're going to go to a couples therapist of my choosing. And we're going to go until we both feel confident that we have the tools that this is not going to happen again. You have to engage in therapy. You have to have a willingness to understand what happened. How did this happen? And how is it not going to happen again? You have to do your own therapy, or you have to allow me to check your phone. So that's a controversial issue, but I do believe that transparency builds trust. And so I know it kind of feels weird and it feels like invasive, but that right to privacy and just blind trust is gone once someone has cheated. And so transparency is what builds trust. So him leaving his phone, you knowing the code to get in, it's always out. There's no like hiding it. There's no taking it with him to the shower, like that sort of thing. It's always out. You can always look at it. That's what helps couples to restore trust. So anyways, this got really long, but I hope it's helpful. And I know that this is probably a question a lot of people have either struggled with or are struggling with. So I'm glad that you asked it, and I hope it's helpful. Yeah, and thank you for reaching out. Please feel free to reach out again if there is something else you want me to speak to.